Okay, this is our second video on understanding percent relationships using models. Make sure you still have your notes. You need to continue your note taking. Pause the video whenever necessary. Okay, we're going to talk this time about finding percent of a number. And percent of a number means if I know that I have 350 items and I want to find 20% of this amount, how much would 20% be? That's finding percent of a number. Okay, how are 20% of 100 and 20% of 300 different? That's a clear word there, different, if they are the same percent. Here's Fred. Huh? They're not different. They're the same. 20% equals 20. Do you agree with Fred's answer? Give a thumbs up if you agree, thumbs down if you disagree. Well, the quantity that a percent represents depends on the whole amount or the whole number. Here, the whole is 20%. Here, the whole is 300. And this represents 20%. So 20% does not always equal 20. If we have the whole of 100 squares, then yes, 20% would be 20. But if we have 300 squares, then it's going to be 20 for each 100. So there'd be 20 for the first 100, plus 20 more for the second 100, plus 20 more for the third 100. And 20 plus 20 plus 20 equals 60. So 20% of 100 equals 20, but 20% of 300 equals 60. So even though they're the same percent, they're not the same amounts because their whole amounts are different. And that's what we're going to focus on. We're going to be given the percent, and we're going to have to figure out how many parts we need to shade, how many squares we need to shade. So taking a look at our first example, this is another 10 by 10, so there's 100 squares. We want to shade 40%. So we need to shade 40 out of 100. And since there are 100 squares, then we can go ahead and shade 40. So there's 10, 20, 30, and 40. You can use your pencil, you can use a pen. If you have a colored pencil, you can use a colored pencil. Whatever you need to do your shading. I'm going to move this one out of the way here. Okay, let's look at the second grid. Again, we want to shade 40%. So are there 100 squares here? So we want to shade 40%, which needs to be per 100. There's definitely not 100 squares there. If we count them up, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a 5 by 5 grid, so there's 25 squares. We need to make 100 squares. So we can make more groups. I'm going to move this one over a little bit. So now I've made 4 groups of 25, which equals 100. Now that I have 100 squares, I can shade 40. But because they're 4 different groups, 4 different grids, I need to shade equal parts in each grid. So I'm going to take the 40 that I want to shade, and I'm going to divide it by the 4 grids. That means for each grid, we want to shade 10. So there's 5. I should actually use a different color. So there's 5, 10 shaded in the first grid, 5, 10 shaded in the second grid, 5, 10 in the third grid, 5, and 10 in the fourth grid. So if I count everything up, I have 100 total squares. And how many total shaded do I have? I have 10 here, plus 10, plus 10, plus 10 is 40. So I have 40 out of my 100, which is the 40%. But I only want one grid. I don't want all 4 grids. So how many would you shade in just one grid? You would shade 10. There's got to be an easier way, right? There is. So let's go ahead and delete all of this and go back to the original. we can go back and use our proportion. So we want 40% shaded out of 100, but we have 25 squares. Okay, so how many squares do we need to shade out of the 25? Well, this time we're getting smaller. We're going from 100 to 25. So that means we're going to divide. And we could divide 100 by 4, and that will give us 25. Do the same thing to the 40%, divide it by 4. 40 divided by 4 gives us 10. So we want to shade the 10 squares out of the 25. And this represents 40%. Much easier than going and duplicating all of the grids. So let's try the last one. Okay, this is a 4 by 5, so there's 20 squares here. And again, we want to shade 40%, and that 40% is out of 100. Percent's always out of 100. Okay, use your proportion. We're getting smaller. We're going from 100 squares to 20 squares, so we divide by 5. Do the same thing with the 40. 40 divided by 5 will give us 8. So we need to shade 8 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We have shaded 40%. Let's try a couple more. This time we want to shade 80% of each figure. All right, take a look at the first figure. It's a flower. We want to shade 80% of the petals. Well, how many petals are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's only 5 petals. And we know to shade 80%, we need to have 100 petals. So we're going to go smaller in size. We're going to go from 100 petals to 5 petals. And to do that, the skill factor would be to divide by 20. So do the same thing with your 80. Divide it by 20, and you get 4. So we need to shade 4 of the flower petals. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we have just shaded 80% of the flower petals. Our next example has boxes. So again, we want 80% shaded, 80% out of 100. But there's not 100 boxes. So how many boxes are there? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. There are 20 boxes. So we're going from 100 to 20. To do that, we divide by 5. Do the same thing up here in the numerator. Divide our 80% by 5, and we get 16. Excuse me. We want to shade 16 of the boxes. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, and 16. All right, now we have shaded 80% of our figure. Okay, you're ready for your independent practice. Explain how to determine the number of balloons to shade if you want 80% of the balloons shaded. So this is a little bit of a journal writing. Explain it in words. You can also show work as well.